Welcome to EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. I'm your host, Russ Roberts of George Mason University and Stanford University's Hoover Institution. Our website is econtalk.org, where you can subscribe, find other episodes, comment on this podcast, and find links and other information related to today's conversation. Our email address is mail@econtalk.org. We'd love to hear from you. Today is September 14th, 2009, and my guest is Paul Buchheit, creator and lead developer of Gmail and founder of Friendfeed, which was recently acquired by Facebook. Paul, welcome to EconTalk.
Hi, Russ.
Tell us how Gmail got started.
Basically, they just gave me the task of working on some kind of email or personal information system, and it was, very much a wide open kind of request. There was a feeling that there was a tremendous amount of useful information that was locked away inside of email, and that there was a lot of room for innovation. But there wasn't necessarily like a clear idea of what we were building from the start. And so I essentially just got started by building a system to index and search my own email, and then we iterated from there and just continually added new features, tried new things out, and after actually using and iterating on the product for a couple of years, we got to the point where it was something that we felt was ready to launch.
How long did that take, roughly? Would you say a couple years? Was it?
Yeah, it was actually a relatively long process. To start with, it was just myself working on it, and that was late 2001 that I started working on it. And so it was a little bit slow from the start, and we explored a lot of different ideas that we never launched in the product.
Sure.
And some of the things did launch, but much later. So, for example, we prototyped some of the IM integration that eventually didn't make it out into the initial release, but then was eventually added about maybe a year later after the initial launch.
So when was the initial launch?
The initial launch was April 1st, 2004, I believe.
Okay, and that was when you had to be invited, and that
exactly. So that was it was an invite-only system for actually, I think it may have been a couple of years that it was run invite-only. So, and in the very early days, it was actually very difficult to get the invitation. So people were actually selling them on eBay for, in some cases, I think even hundreds of dollars.
Uh-huh.
So that was a lot of fun.
And how many people were working on it at its height? Say, you said you start off by yourself. How big did it get?
Well, by now I think it's a fairly substantial team. I don't even know exactly. I left Google about 3.5 years ago. But at the time that we launched, I would estimate the core team was about a dozen people.
Uh-huh. And how did you decide among yourselves how it would emerge, what features it would have, what features it wouldn't have, and what was the process?
Well, it was a very iterative process. So we would periodically have a little brainstorming session and just think of lots of different ideas, and also we spent a lot of time talking to people inside of the company about their email needs, their problems. So we might just sit down and actually just watch someone use their email for a little while, obviously with their consent, and they would just explain the problems that they ran into and what systems they used, and that was actually very educational. One of the things we discovered was that a lot of people had essentially two different systems. They had the system they wanted to be using and the system they were actually using. So they would start off by showing us, for example, a big complex folder hierarchy where they would sort, all of their mail into one of these carefully named folders. And then I would notice there was something called Inbox 2, and I said, well, what's Inbox 2? They're like, well, and they'd be kind of embarrassed. They're like, well, my inbox just got too big, so I renamed it Inbox 2 and made a new one. And it turned out what they were actually doing was just leaving everything in their inbox because they would fall behind.
Yes.
And so even though they had this intricate folder system, in practice they just had everything sitting there in their inbox. And, that was one of the one of the usage patterns that we thought wasn't very well supported by a lot of the existing mail systems that assumed that everyone was going to sort their mail carefully into folders. And that was also more similar to the way that I worked, which was just I would look at email, I would respond to it, or I would just star it for later on. And then, if I'm done with it, I would just wanted it to go away into the archive, is what we ended up naming it. And then, if I need to retrieve it later on, I could just search for it. And so a lot of the initial design was built around that paradigm of, instead of having to spend a lot of time sorting my mail up front, I could just search for it later on if I needed to find it.
Yes, that is the way I do it. I'm not happy with that. Do you have any advice for those out there who have at least dozens, if not hundreds of emails we should have done something else with?
Well, I think maybe just get over the guilt.
Yeah.
I think part of it is there's this perception that there's a right way to do email, and a lot of it just comes down to personality. Some people really love organizing their email, and that's great. But others of us just don't.
Yeah.
And I think that you just have to be comfortable with that. And we tried to build the system to accommodate those people really well, because I felt like those people have been neglected a lot of times. And so, some of the things that we did, such as the automatic organization into conversations, helps a lot, because another thing that we saw people do was spend a lot of time trying to reassemble these conversations. For example, they would sort by subject so that they could find the other messages in the thread. And we said, well, that's that's kind of a wasteful activity. By just putting it all together, it's a much more efficient experience. I can just read the whole conversation all at once. If I've been away all day and I haven't been reading email and there's been a big discussion, I can catch up very quickly. It hasn't flooded my inbox just because there were, let's say 30 messages. It's still just one line in my inbox. And so we did a lot of things to try to just make it more automatic and reduce the need for manual labor.
Which feature are you most proud of?
That's a good question. I don't know if there's any one thing. I mean, I think one of the aspects of the product that was most influential was actually the fact that we did it all, the front end all in JavaScript, which at the time, people kind of considered webmail to be a toy, and that if you wanted if you were serious about email, you had to install a client on your computer, use Outlook or something like that.
Yeah.
And so by building what was actually a really great email experience right in the browser, I think that a lot of people saw that and said, wow, the web is real. We can build applications on top of this. And I've actually talked to a number of people who are working on different products who actually had that experience. Like, they looked at it and they're actually inspired by it and said, wow, what else can I do with the JavaScript and all the modern browser technology? And so I think that's actually one of the most interesting parts of it. And we see a lot of that today, where people are building whole office suites on the web and really every other application as well.
It does appear to be the wave of the future. Now, is it correct that you were employee number 23?
Yes.
At Google? So that was very early on, presumably. And I'm curious, you were in a funny position as developer of Gmail. You were, it sounds like, a fairly standalone entrepreneur within a company, a pretty entrepreneurial company. I'm curious.
Right.
I'm curious how that integration worked out.
It was occasionally, I think, a little bit bumpy, just because at the time that I started the project, most of the rest of the company was entirely focused on search, web search in particular, and also the advertising. And so a lot of people questioned why we were even building Gmail. They thought it was a bad idea, an unnecessary distraction. And also technically a lot of the infrastructure assumptions turned out to be wrong. So, for example, when you're crawling the web, if something goes wrong and you lose a few web pages, it isn't really a big problem, because you can just go fetch them again later. But when you're building an email system, obviously you can't ever lose anything. You need to be very meticulous about keeping track of all of the data and making sure everything updates instantly. And that those assumptions actually work their way down the entire technology stack. All the way down to some of the very low-level decisions in the system are impacted by the need to be reliable and available all of the time.
I'm curious that you said it was a distraction. It doesn't seem to be a distraction, right? You start off being the whole thing. Then maybe a dozen people are working on it. You're off somewhere in a corner. You're working on this cool thing, maybe. And if it doesn't work out, that's life. How did that? What happened within the company that made it more complicated than that you can talk about?
Well, obviously I thought it was a good thing to do, but there's I think an argument that can be made that companies can only do so many things well, and at the time there was a perception within the company even that we were really just this search technology company, and that wasn't universal, obviously, but I think a lot of people had this notion even that this was back when Google was powering search for Yahoo and a bunch of other sites, and a lot of people kind of had this perception, well, we're just providing back-end technology for someone else. And then all of a sudden, and so within that framework, the notion of building this consumer email product doesn't make a lot of sense. And potentially threatens a lot of those partnerships because, Yahoo probably wasn't too pleased when they discovered Gmail. And so
sure.
I think people had,
big issue.
Reasonable reasons to be concerned.
Sure. But part of the reason it's been successful, besides the fact that, quote, so many people are using it, obviously that's one measure of success. And I'm a user, by the way, and I've pretty much dropped my desktop email version that I had been using before, desktop program that I'd been using. There are two issues that come to mind. One is Gmail was down last week. I know it has nothing to do with you, but a week or two ago, Gmail went down for a few hours, or it was sporadic. Sure. I think a lot of us who've been relying on it felt a tremor, which is, of course, there are a lot of tremors in our email lives, but Gmail we've always thought is sort of 100% reliable, which is, of course, impossible. But the second aspect from Google's end is the financial side and the use of advertising on Gmail. So talk about those two things, sort of its level of success is just as a consumer product in terms of reliability, and then its financial implications for Google. Right.
Well, so, I mean, the reliability issue is obviously really important, and it's even though I'm not working there, it's still kind of painful when there's a big outage like that. But I think it's also important to keep some perspective on reliability. It's very annoying to not be able to access your email for an hour or something like that every couple of months, but that's the reality of most systems. Even if you're operating your own email, that can happen. And when I think of just personally, like the power at my house is similarly reliable.
Sure.
Right. Like I lose electricity more often than I lose access to Gmail.
Yeah.
One's
provided usually by a local government, and one's provided by a profit motivated corporation. So it goes both ways.
I think PG&E is profit oriented too. But
I guess they are.
I don't know why I lose power at my house so much, but it happens like a couple times a month. And but my point is that I think it's one of these issues that people like to bring up a lot because it seems really important, but at a practical level, the things that actually cause me problem on a day-to-day basis, it's very rare that's a big issue for me. So I think it's something that's important to get right. But at the same time, I think maybe sometimes people overestimate like the significance of an outage like that.
How about on the financial side?
And can you be a little more specific about what you mean the financial side?
Well, I get little ads at the top of my Gmail, and in general, like many people, I find ads on the internet somewhat annoying.
Right.
But I found the Gmail ones to be more interesting than annoying. I'm fascinated by how successfully targeted they are sometimes to my interests, and I click on them every once in a while. Not very often, but much more often than I click on ads on any other page. So it's a very successful system. Given that I'm a skeptic, that I use it now and then is impressive, and I assume that's generating some serious money for Google.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I obviously don't even know what the revenue numbers are, but it's exactly as you say. It's one of these things where it is surprisingly relevant sometimes, and the nature of that kind of directed advertising is that the payoff is pretty good. I think if you actually deliver an interested customer. So I've actually bought things off of the ads in my Gmail a couple of times, and you say, well, it's only been a few times, but the system
a lot of emails
that we built was sufficiently optimized that you actually don't need to make that much money off of ads in order to cover the cost of operating it. So, and that was obviously another challenge just in building the system is keeping the operational costs low enough that it can be run economically.
We recently did a podcast with John Nye, and we talked about people's levels of trust and comfort interacting anonymously with strangers, and how after an economics crisis like the one we're in the middle of now, there tends to be more skepticism about the virtues of capitalism. People are less comfortable with markets. And one thing that people have raised about Google and Gmail is that my emails being on the Gmail account and Google having a lot of information about me on the server, and that's why you're able to generate those fascinatingly targeted ads, or even just sometimes links to articles I'm interested in. That gives a lot of people the willies. They find it a little bit frightening that there's so much information about me, from my emails to my searches, stored somewhere on Google.
Right.
How do you feel about that, especially now that you're not there?
Yeah, it doesn't particularly concern me. I mean, I have a lot of broader privacy concerns just about electronic data in general. The fact that my email can all be subpoenaed as part of a lawsuit. That concerns me a lot more than Google having it, because I think Google has a lot of very strong incentives to be careful with the data. If they did something bad, it causes a very severe, it could cause a lot of damage to their business if any of my data gets out. So I trust them to take care of my data. The problem is, of course, that they are subject to the law, just like everyone else. And a lot of times people don't like that, but it's just a fact. They can't. If the government shows up and says, we need this for whatever reason, it can be difficult to say no, and that concerns me a lot more. And that's just a fact about any system. It isn't Google specific. At any time, I can be legally compelled, and even if I had it on my own server, if people show up and there's a lawsuit and it's going to become evidence, I can't just pretend I don't have it. That wouldn't be.
It's awkward.
That would be. I think it's called obstruction of justice or something.
It's a negative. It's definitely bad.
It's something you don't want to do.
Definitely.
And I think that's actually like a bigger concern, that as a lot of our communication moves from kind of ephemeral medium, like if I just get together and chat in a room with someone, that doesn't end up becoming evidence. But if all of a sudden I start doing it online and over IM or email, then suddenly this offhand conversations could become evidence in a trial. And I think that's actually kind of problematic because of two things. One is just that, maybe it wasn't a carefully considered comment because you were just IMing with someone at night. And secondly, it encourages people to destroy that information. A lot of companies have email retention policies where they automatically delete email. And, I think that's kind of unfortunate for the world that we're creating incentives to destroy historical records.
Yeah, no, there's definitely a trade-off there. It's an interesting point. But I'm going to go back to your remark that you trust Google. Obviously, you don't literally trust them. You just assume the incentives are in place, that there is no Google to trust.
I also literally trust them. I know the people there,
right. Well,
and they're good people.
But you don't know all the people involved with the potential access, and so you assume there's some kind of firewall / security procedure in place to keep people from rifling through folks' email and all that. Right.
And that's something that you have, though, with any service provider. Even if you're, let's say, within a company, a lot of times people debate, like, is it safe to have our email stored, let's say, on Google systems? And the point that oftentimes gets overlooked is it safe to have it internally where there's, whatever the local sysadmin who might have personal issues with some of the people in the company or
Sure.
whatever else, right?
Sure.
And so I actually think that in many cases it's safer just because, that is what they do, and they have some of the best people in the world doing it. So
you are credited with coming up with the phrase "Don't be evil." Is that true as far as you know? And does it have any significance other than it's kind of cool?
That is true. It was there was a company meeting, I think sometime maybe in early 2001, where we were trying to decide on company values. And, typically corporations come up with some really bland values that are completely forgettable. And,
Yep.
and I wanted something a little bit more interesting, and also maybe make people a little bit uncomfortable and make people think. And I don't know, that somehow that just came up. And then at first people didn't really take it seriously, but myself and another engineer, Amit Patel, managed to keep it alive long enough that it kind of took on a life of its own. And I do actually think that it has a lot of value. I mean, beyond just being kind of this cute phrase, the thing that I think is so valuable about it is that it actually gives everyone in the company license to question the decisions. And I mean, I've literally been in a meeting where someone said, "But wait, is this evil?" And they were serious. Mm-hmm. And then, there would be like a little debate about whether it was evil or not.
Yeah.
And I think that process is very important, because too often in some large organization, there's this attitude, well, it's not your job to worry about that. Your job is to do what you're told. So, shut up and do your job.
Right. And you can quit if you want, but it's better to question than quit if you could stop it.
Sure, exactly. And so just the fact that everyone essentially has permission to stop and question things, I think, creates a more thoughtful organization.
Does it have a formal, is it a motto or just
it's
catchphrase? What is it?
It was one of the corporate values. There was
it was a list,
10 of them or something.
Yeah.
But it's the only one that anyone remembers.
Yeah, no, it would be. I put it in the pantheon with, the Ritz-Carlton's motto is "Ladies and gentlemen serving ladies and gentlemen." I've always thought that was clever, memorable, and it does motivate a lot of behavior there. They all know it, at least, which is because it's memorable.
Yeah, I think it's important for things to be memorable. There's only so many things that are going to be on your mind at any time, and you can create some carefully crafted statement that has all of your values tucked in, but if it's forgettable, it doesn't matter, right? Or
long, which means it's forgettable. It's "Don't be evil" is short too, which is really good.
Yeah.
How did Google? When did you said you left around 2006? Is that right?
Yes, May 2006.
So to be employee number 23? Roughly, when did you get there?
June 1999.
So roughly 6 years.
Almost 7 years.
And how did the company change while you were there?
Well, it got a lot bigger.
A lot, yeah.
It was obviously just a little startup when I joined, and I had fairly low expectations, to be honest. The search market was pretty crowded back in '99. There were some really big companies like
Lycos.
Alta Vista. Well, yeah, I mean all of the portals, but
Alta Vista. That's who I meant.
I think Alta Vista was really the giants in search, and they had hundreds of engineers. They had just spent, I think, like $100 million on some kind of marketing campaign. So clearly they had money to burn. They had huge traffic, and the thing that I didn't quite understand is I was just thinking to myself, I don't know how this little company is ever going to make it against this behemoth, because if they start to get traction, Alta Vista will just copy whatever they're doing, right? But the people seemed pretty smart, and so I thought that it would be a good learning experience to go join this little startup and watch them get crushed or whatever.
Yeah, sure. No, you'd get some.
And there were smart people, so there was a lot to learn, technically at least, and it was to me a very interesting problem. I really like. I just really like the access to information and all of that. So I went in with fairly low expectations for things, but I found that I just really liked working there. I previously worked at a number of big companies, so immediately prior to Google, I worked at Intel, which is
the opposite.
Yeah,
at the
very
time.
big company, a big sea of gray cubicles, and I didn't, it just wasn't for me. And so it was actually a really great experience to go over to this little startup where everyone was excited and there was just an energy to the place. And so that was just a really great experience. And then obviously, it had so many smart people that I was able to just learn so much about systems and about product and everything else. So I like to sometimes also just compare it to a sort of postgraduate education.
Sure.
I can't imagine, just from a strictly educational standpoint, I can't imagine a better experience.
And how did it change over the time you were there? How much of that excitement and educational value persisted, do you think, for new employees?
Well,
that culture is hard to keep.
Yeah, I mean, it's very difficult because, they've innovated in a lot of fronts. I mean, they've created some very interesting products and very interesting technologies. I think a lot of the organizational methods are relatively conventional, and, they brought in a lot of experienced managers from other companies who kind of implemented the same strategies that things were done elsewhere, and inevitably, there's just a lot of incentives that change over time. When it's a little startup, it's kind of like everyone's in it together, right? Because if the company fails, like, you all fail.
Sure, and every one of them.
When you're in a bigger company, the incentives get a little more complex because, certainly, like, the stock price isn't a very good proxy for anything, because you could be creating some cool new product, but really the stock price is going to be driven by, like, something in the ad market. And if you're not working on ads, you probably have, like, very little direct impact, right? Mm-hmm. And so it becomes very difficult to kind of create the right incentives for risk taking. And ultimately, I think over time, what happens in a big company is you get lots of negative incentives. So people are incentivized not to screw up, not to cause disasters, but the positive incentives tend to disappear. So, if there's something you could do that maybe has a 10% chance of creating a $1 billion business and a 90% chance of making you look dumb, which one are you going to do?
Yeah.
And even if you're willing to kind of gamble with looking stupid, is your boss going to go ahead with that? And ultimately, those incentives over time have an effect on how people make decisions, the kinds of people who work in an organization, and it all feeds back on itself.
So you don't think they're going to take over the world?
Well, I think they'll continue doing very well.
Not the same thing.
They have a lot of great products, and they're continuing to come out with good stuff. I mean, you have to remember that their primary competition in many cases is like Microsoft. And, whatever big company issues they have, I think a lot of their competitors have them to a much greater extent.
No, for sure. But I always think it's funny how people just assume that growth rates are going to continue.
You're right.
And it's hard. It's hard. Things slow you down. Monitoring, oversight, the culture changes. You can't control it anymore. You couldn't control it at the beginning much anyway, and then suddenly you're in a different kind of company, and it's a lot harder to change. Get ahead.
Yeah, it's a very difficult problem. But I think a lot of it goes back to people are still trying to apply industrial era methods and thinking to these new problems, which are completely unlike running a factory.
Yeah.
In a factory, you can usually measure and monitor everyone's output, and it's all, you can be very scientific about it. And in a more creative endeavor, like creating new products, all of that, none of that works. You can't measure people's output very well. You can't, the entire incentive system has to be changed. The entire management system needs to be changed.
Well, let's talk about that for a sec before we move on. It is hard to measure, but my guess is when you were leading that Gmail team and you had 12 people working for you, if one of them wasn't doing a very good job, even though you might not be able to quantify it, you probably knew it.
Right. So actually, that's one of the things that I think is maybe needs a little more attention. Is in practice, when you look at these teams, the people on the team know who the really good people are and who's really contributing and who's not. And that's that's the most valuable information, I think, is really to bring it down to the team level and have people essentially picking who they want to work with, and work for, and instead of taking kind of the top-down measurement approach, actually having people evaluating their peers to a greater extent. And I don't mean like writing some big evaluation. I mean actually choosing, who do I want to work with? Because that's actually a really good indicator, right?
Sure.
If you just think about which people do you want to work with, well, you want to work with generally the people who get things done.
It depends. It depends.
You want to be on a good team. Well,
depends what kind of person you are. Yeah.
It depends what your incentives are, but if you're the kind of person who likes to create new products and ship things and everything else, you want to work with other people like that, and also people who have complementary skill sets.
Yep.
And so it also is a big issue because there's oftentimes this mindset, well, this is a level 4 engineer. This person is capable of the following things. But in practice, there's just a tremendous amount of variation. Each person has a different personality, a different set of skills and strengths, and building effective teams is actually a pretty tricky thing because you kind of want that perfect mix of personalities and abilities.
It's a classic problem in economics of how to measure output, team output. How to attribute team output to individuals, and I think I think it's really a classic problem, as you say, if you're stuck in a top-down world. When you allow people to more freely associate, people have a lot of information, a la Hayek, about who's doing what and who knows what and who's pleasant. I mean, there's subtle things that aren't output's not the only literal thing you care about. You care about who you want to spend time with and who compromises in the right times and not in the wrong, not in the wrong ones. And
exactly. And of course, that does ultimately reflect on the team output. Even if someone is very productive, if they end up causing everyone else to quit, they're probably a net negative, right?
Yep. And of course, it's sometimes hard to figure who that is from the outside. But as you say, from the inside, I think usually people have a pretty good idea. There are exceptions, obviously. It's not as clean as we might hope.
Right.
So I was going to ask you one other thing about. Bing.
Right.
Is it a threat to Google?
I don't know. It isn't obviously a threat when I've looked at it, but I think it is clear that they're starting to take it more seriously. It's the first time I've used one of their products and actually thought, wow, this is actually
pretty good.
Pretty good, right? So, their previous attempts, you look at it and you're like, wow, are they even trying? But this time, I think they're at least putting out a credible product. But at the same time, there's a lot of technology inside of Google that people just aren't even aware of, and so it can be hard for people to know how far behind they are.
Yeah, right. That's true.
Until they really try. That happened with Yahoo, where when they were redoing their ad system, they had this Panama project, and the people in the press were talking about, well, once they come out with this, they'll be able to match Google. But what they were coming out with was something that was equivalent to what Google had 3 years prior. And so it was just a kind of hopeless endeavor in that sense. And the way they were developing it was, at least from the stories I've heard, was a little bit of a disaster. So it was pretty clear they weren't going to catch up.
But it is a classic perception problem. It's a fascinating thing, actually, that people always say, well, they've matched, they've come up with the new iPod. It's just as good as an iPod, as if Apple is just sitting there counting their money and hoping that no one else is going to compete with them.
Right.
And it does happen, right? Sometimes an organization gets fat and happy and doesn't innovate and does get caught or pass. But usually they're pretty worried about their franchise and they're working hard on it. That's a really
I mean, it's very hard if a company has a lead the way Google has and they remain focused on it, and they're able to continually innovate. I think that's tremendously difficult to overcome that lead. I wouldn't try. There's just more there's easier lower hanging fruit elsewhere.
Yeah, but of course I'm always glad someone is trying because that'll keep people on their toes.
I mean, I think competition is a great thing, and I hope that they have success. I mean, I think it will be good for everyone, including Google, to have credible competitors.
Yeah. So let's leave Google behind to the extent we can in 2009. So you left Google. Is Friendfeed the thing you did next?
The thing I did immediately next was just take some time off. So I
Good idea.
Yeah, I took off for maybe about a year and a half or a year, and then my friend Sanjeev Singh, who is the second person on Gmail, decided to leave Google as well. So we started just talking about what's next, and decided that it was time to start a new company. So we started just working on a few different ideas and just kind of getting together and talking about things. And the other thing we did was just keep an eye on what other people we knew who were exiting Google or other
Sure.
things and looking for new opportunities.
Talented folks.
And Brett Taylor and Jim Norris, who are two of the main people behind the Google Maps product, were leaving and to start a startup of their own. And so we just started having dinner with them, maybe a couple times a week, and just chatting about different ideas. And they were kind of doing the same thing of just prototyping things and figuring out what to do next. And ultimately, we ended up deciding that we had a lot of the same goals and ideas in terms of the kind of company we wanted to start and the kind of products we wanted to build and just the underlying philosophy. And ultimately ended up deciding to just form a single company, which was Friendfeed.
I want to hear more about that, but before we do talk about it, I wanted to pry into that year and a half year off as much as I can for a sec. Did you think you were going to take that much time? Did you plan a specific time, or did you just say, I'm going to take some time off until I get excited about something?
I didn't have a specific plan, but I've always been interested in startups, so I did have, I guess, some hope of eventually starting one. But at the time, I really just needed to take some time off. It'd been a fairly eventful couple of years. We'd launched Gmail, this Google IPO, and all of that, and that was very exciting. There were also some other more difficult things. My daughter, my first child, was born the prior year and had a lot of medical issues, so I'd taken off time for that. And also my brother had gotten cancer and died, and so it was just good to take some time off. But after a year or so of that, doing nothing got a little bit boring, and I was very interested in actually working on something that I cared about and could really focus on.
Did you really do nothing?
Well, I hung out at home.
Yeah. Well, it's pleasant. Sorry for prying, and I'm sorry about your brother. Most people don't get to take a year off.
Yeah.
Right? It's a interesting life experience that most of us don't have
Sure.
access to. But you turned eventually to socializing with these talented folks. And how did Friendfeed come about? And for people who don't know what it is, tell us what it is.
So Friendfeed was actually, the initial prototype was something that Brett did kind of on the side while they were working on some other ideas, just because he kind of wanted to keep track of his friends. They had left Google and just wanted a tool for keeping up to date with all the people he knew. And it evolved from there. And so what it ultimately became was a tool for sharing things with people, and having little discussions. So, for example, if I write a blog post or something, I can put it on Friendfeed. My friends will all see it right away, and a lot of times there's little comments, or maybe I read a news story. Like this morning, one of the startups I had invested in called Mint was acquired by Intuit, and so I just post a little message that says, "Congratulations to Aaron and the Mint team," and a link to the TechCrunch story. And then, my friends all see it and they like it or leave a comment.
So what's the difference between Friendfeed and Twitter?
In practice, Friendfeed is a much more conversational medium. So, because of the comments, I might post even a question and there'll be a big long discussion. Mm-hmm. One of the issues we did encounter was that both products evolved over time and in a somewhat convergent manner. So, Twitter started out just being about status updates, And obviously that appeals to some people, but it also is a little bit limited. But over time, the users of Twitter have kind of evolved it to be a lot of other things. And so there's actually a lot of link sharing that goes on Twitter as well.
You bet.
Where people find, an interesting link and they just tweet it out to their friends. And, that was certainly like one of the competitive issues we faced, was that over time people started asking exactly what you asked, which is like, how is this different from Twitter? And, at a feature level, there's a lot of differences, like the comments, the likes, there's images. It's kind of a richer experience, but it is from a mind share perspective, people have kind of like different buckets for different products.
Yeah.
And it was a problem that we were kind of ending up in a similar bucket with a much larger product.
Yeah, well, I want to talk about that for a sec, because it's such an interesting phenomenon that you say Twitter started off as a status updating phenomenon. And again, as I mentioned recently, we're on Twitter at EconTalker, EconTalker, if you want to follow us. But I find it, fascinating that people who are, I'm 54, I'll be 55 in a few days, but people above the age of maybe 30 or so, or 35, think Twitter is about telling people what you had for breakfast, and they can't understand why anybody would possibly use it. And of course, some people are interested in what other people, their friends, have for breakfast. That's perfectly fine, but I use it mainly as a miniature blogging platform, which is extremely useful, and it has the character limit of it is bracing. It encourages brevity and thoughtfulness. So I find that a plus most of the time. But as you say, it isn't how it started. So you had this challenge, and what has happened in the meanwhile? Why have you been successful, and given that you had a very large, serious competitor? Right.
Well, to be fair, they've been more successful than we were. So, but yeah, we always had a fairly loyal user base. A lot of people were interested, as I mentioned, in the conversational aspect of it. So, Twitter, you can @reply people, but those @replies are all kind of independent.
Yeah, they're all public and weird. I've not caught on really.
Because of the comments on Friendfeed, what you end up having is a discussion which can sometimes have hundreds of comments, and the comments are all aware of each other. So it's more like a bunch of people in a room talking together versus you just kind of hear back independent messages from different people. So it really changes the dynamic of it. Mm-hmm. So in practice, it ends up being a fairly different service in many ways, but it does have a lot of that same kind of micro blogging aspect to it. Like yesterday, I posted a picture of my new shoes because I bought some of the if you've seen these Vibram like their toe shoes, and so I tried those. I was running around the block in them.
How's that working for you?
Pretty good. It's interesting. There's a book called Born to Run, which I think a lot of people have been reading recently. It's a pretty interesting book. But
is it about the shoes?
You end up wanting to buy the shoes and giving it a try.
Interesting. And you move forward on your toes? Is that the idea of them?
Yeah. The basic story starts off with this. The author has terrible foot and leg pains when he runs. And whenever he goes to the doctor just tells him, well, you weren't meant to run. People like you, he's like a big guy, I guess. So, you're not meant to run. So he just kind of keeps investigating this problem, and he ends up meeting these other people who have encountered the same thing, and ultimately discovered that the problem, at least for them, was caused by the padding in their shoes, and the fact that isolating your feet from the environment actually causes you to run in the wrong way and put stress in the wrong places. And so by actually having less insulation, your body gets better feedback from the environment. You run in a different style where you're not landing on your heel, you're landing more on the other parts of your feet. And consequently, it just works.
Well,
and so you can run hundreds of miles without causing damage to your body.
It sounds like a hoax, but okay, it's interesting.
It's a very interesting book. it's I mean, it isn't at all strictly like a research paper or something.
I understand.
It's more of an entertaining book, but it has a lot of very interesting insights, and I think it's actually an interesting thing just to think about, like this notion of the dangers of insulating ourselves from reality too much, where I mean, this kind of loops back to some of the organizational things as well, where I think like sometimes there's a tendency to put up too many barriers between ourselves and reality, and consequently we end up making bad decisions because we're not really getting the right feedback.
Yeah, no, that's very interesting. So we don't do product placement here, but and we don't have any sponsors. But what kind of shoes are they called? What are they called?
Vibram.
Vibram. Like, okay.
Yeah. If you look at my Friendfeed, it's friendfeed.com/Paul.
Okay.
See a picture of my feet.
we look forward to putting that up on the putting it up on a link to this conversation. But getting back to Friendfeed, so Facebook acquired Friendfeed last month, I think.
Right.
And I'm curious, what do you think? Do you know what they're going to do with it? And because in my mind, which of course I'm not a heavy-duty social networker, I'm a very, very modest social networker. But in my mind, Facebook and Twitter are kind of competing for how people pay attention to these micro conversations. So how is Friendfeed is it going to be part of Facebook, or is it going to be standalone?
Well, for the time being, the site is pretty much going to just stay the way it is. The team is presently spending a lot of time just learning about the inside of Facebook, meeting all of the teams, and basically figuring out what the next steps are in terms of bringing a lot of what we've learned building Friendfeed to Facebook and how best to integrate that knowledge and experience. I mentioned we kind of had this issue with Friendfeed that the Twitter community had evolved that product to be a little bit more like what we were building. Simultaneously, there was the same issue that Facebook as a product was kind of evolving in the same direction.
Yep,
so
sure.
They added, so they were all keeping an eye on Friendfeed as well, and so they added comments and likes and a lot of these same features that we had. And so I think that we were very much on a convergent path where, although Friendfeed and Facebook are presently very different products, we had a lot of the same ideas about the kind of product that we ultimately wanted to build. Mm-hmm. And so, since we're kind of both headed to the same destination, there is, I thought that was a good opportunity to work together.
So do I need to get on Friendfeed?
Sure, give it a try.
Oh, another one. What?
I mean, you don't have to, but if you're interested.
No, I'm half serious and half joking. But
it's a very easy thing to try out, too, by the way. There's just a one-click button on the homepage if you want. You can click on Twitter or Facebook, and it'll just pull in your information from there. You don't have to do much.
I don't have to do anything independently of those two if I don't want to.
Right, you can just click on one of those buttons, and then you're logged in, and you see all of your friends, what they're sharing. And
I just get more of a different kind of interface for interacting with those comments of theirs?
It's probably easiest if you give it a try. It ends up being actually different things for different people, in part because if your friends are very active on Friendfeed, it's a very different thing versus if they've just signed in once and maybe connected a couple of their accounts but don't come back. And so naturally, like a lot of my friends are fairly active on Friendfeed, so it ends up being a different experience from maybe someone else who just comes along and doesn't know anyone there.
Well, I'm kind of asking about it naively on purpose because I was told by somebody that what Friendfeed does is combine Facebook and Twitter, so I don't have to go to both. But that's not the way you conceive of it, obviously.
No, not really. And that was again maybe one of the challenges we faced was that there is this notion that Friendfeed was an aggregator, and that's not really the model that we had for it, but it was how a lot of people perceived it. Mm-hmm. And I think that was something that maybe we didn't do a good enough job with communication. The core concept that it was based around is sharing, and so the notion of the aggregation features was, well, if you're already sharing things somewhere else, it should just automatically show up here. So if you already have a blog, instead of having to, make a blog post and then go to Friendfeed and say, hey, I have a new blog post, why not just bring it in automatically?
Well, I really like that.
And so, right, and
That's
so
good.
that logically seemed like a nice feature to have, but the downside of that is that it creates this notion that, well, it's just this thing that aggregates.
Okay, so it's more than that, though. So it is that,
right? It does a lot more than that, but it is always it's a very interesting kind of business issue of sometimes features maybe even hurt you.
Sure.
Because it changes how people perceive what it is.
Makes it harder to communicate what it is. Yeah. I like when you said it's a way to share stuff. One of the things we've been talking about recently, and I think about a lot, is how technology changes our lives, and sharing is really maybe when it's in the top 3 for what humans do, and technology helps us share. And I think there's a backlash, especially among older folks, about technology as a anti-human device, and yet on the other side, it's the ultimate in helping us be more human.
Right.
Where do you think this is going? What do you think it's going to look like down the road? The explosion's unbelievable in terms of online sharing.
Right.
An example I like is just the number of photographs on the web and what we can look at and share with each other about what we're up to. It's it's in the billions, tens of billions soon, if not already. Well, I'm sure it's already in that. So what do you think of that? Where's it going?
Yeah, I think it's just we're just going to see more of it essentially for quite a while. I mean, every time you lower the friction essentially to sharing, people share more stuff. So like now that the cell phones all have pretty good cameras, or at least the popular ones do, people start taking pictures with their cell phone and just sharing it with their friends. And I think that really helps connect people in a way that wasn't previously practical, just because if you wouldn't get out your film camera, take a picture of something funny you saw, get it developed, mail it to your friends in an envelope. It just doesn't make sense. But it helps connect people, especially who are maybe more distant. So I mentioned when my daughter was born, she was in the hospital for quite a while. That was the first time I started blogging. I started up a blog kind of immediately so that I could just post updates about how she was doing, so that I didn't have to go talk to each person in my family, repeat the difficulties of the day. And so I just started every day posting a picture of my daughter and a little status update about how she's doing. And that was really good, I think, for my family. It was actually my mother who'd never really used computers before, all of a sudden needed to get a computer so that she could keep up to date on her granddaughter. I think it's a great example of just the positive power of technology.
Yeah, no, it's an incredible thing. Any speculation on, besides more, we're obviously going to do a lot more, especially as technology makes it cheaper to do even more, but I think the texture of it's going to change.
Certainly. I mean, as I mentioned, just as the friction decreases, the kinds of things that people share change, because all of these things that I gave the example with the shoes before, and then we had this whole conversation about shoes, and the only reason that happened was because I was sitting in my backyard, and it was very easy for me to suddenly post a picture of my feet, and that's the kind of thing that would never have happened before, because it wasn't important enough for me to spend a lot of time on. But it was something that, 30 seconds to share, hey, I got these new shoes and it worked well this time.
Yeah,
with my friends or with whoever else is interested. That really changes just the kinds of things we share. And it also just changes, in this case, your relationship with brands. The entire way that I think the consumer economy works is changing, because previously it was all about just telling people what they needed to think and throwing a lot of money at it. Now you actually have to, make your customers happy.
Yeah.
You can't just lure them in and rely on their ignorance. And that now, if I don't like something, I'm going to tell other people about it. And, Yelp is a great example of this. My wife is really into Yelp. and she got breakfast at some restaurant, and they didn't have bananas, and she mentioned that in her Yelp review that she was disappointed they were out of bananas, and then the owner of the restaurant contacted her, I think via Yelp directly, and apologized and said, "Oh, please, next time you come back, I promise there will be bananas." And that kind of service is really great, and it's the kind of thing that I think again just shows the positive potential of this technology.
Yeah, in the old days, if you wrote a letter complaining, you'd sometimes get a nice letter back with a gift certificate for, breakfast at the restaurant, and they'd hoped it wasn't purely, kindness. They were hoping you'd tell your friends they were assuming you probably told a few people you had a bad experience, so they're hoping now you'll say you had a good one.
Right.
But when you tell a few thousand, it makes or a few tens of thousands, it does make a bigger splash.
And it just changes the kinds of people who are doing these things. So, if you're writing a letter to a restaurant, I don't know, that's just not the kind of thing that I think most people would do. You're probably a sort of extreme personality.
Yep. You'd have to have had a really bad breakfast.
Yeah, and you maybe, you're just not a normal person probably, or you just have an awful lot of time on your hands. Whereas now, a lot of these things are so easy that just normal people are doing it as part of their everyday life, and so it changes the kinds of feedback that you get, because it isn't just crazy old cranks who don't have anything else to do or whatever, right? It's just like regular people who take a few seconds to report their experience, or I guess in the case of Yelp, there's a whole social element where people like to they just enjoy writing reviews.
And of course, some people abuse it. I've noticed that in some, everywhere from Amazon book reviews to restaurant reviews, people will sometimes try to plant a negative review
of course,
for strategic purposes. It'll be interesting to see how the culture of authenticity evolves in this world, because it's extremely important to helping it work well.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's part of I think really the power of something like Facebook, is because it has a culture of real identities and real relationships, you start to actually see the truth, right? So, instead of just seeing a review from someone, skater girl or whatever, you actually see, it's from my friend.
Yep.
And that's a lot more meaningful, and it also makes it harder for people to do these fake reviews or whatever else, because it either shows up with some fake name, or you see this person is friends with the owner or whatever it is, right?
For sure. Yeah, there's a real art to the inauthentic, seemingly authentic review, and not everybody can pull it off. Yeah,
a lot of times they're pretty obvious on Amazon.
Yeah, on both directions. The rave review of the book by the mom is pretty transparent usually. We're almost out of time. What is next for you? You're going to take a year off, or are you going to do something else? Do you have any ideas?
No, I'm working here at Facebook, so I'm this is what's next for me. So part of the reason that the deal made sense was because there are a lot of really exciting opportunities here. I mean, I think Facebook is a company that has the potential to be extremely influential, much in the same way that Google has been, not just in terms of business success, but in terms of essentially setting the standard for the Valley. And so that's a pretty interesting opportunity.
Yeah, well, both of them change our lives in all kinds of, mostly, I think, very, very good ways, how we interact with each other. Well, let's close with a discussion about the Valley. You've been there a while. What do you think of Silicon Valley, and how has it changed while you've been there, and where do you think it's going?
Well, let's see. I don't know if I've been here long enough to give a long-term report. I've been here, I guess, I moved out. I was here in 97 and then moved out permanently in 98. Obviously, the biggest changes have just been the bubble, at the end of the 90s, where anyone could start a company and then mysteriously IPO without any real product or anything at all. And so I think it's a place that is very dynamic, just because the economy changes so much, and the swing of technology is very quick. So the kinds of companies that people are founding changes, but the core of it, I think, seems pretty solid. It's a place where people are very comfortable with the notion of taking risks and just trying things that may not work, and that's, I think, really the heart of it. The thing that makes it work is the fact that, like my quitting a job at safe big company Intel and joining some little startup like Google wasn't seen as a bad idea.
Right, sure.
Whereas I think a lot of other places in the world, people would be like, what are you doing? You had a good job. Why would you go? Like, I actually had that experience, I think, early on where people outside of Silicon Valley didn't quite understand what had happened because they perceived working at Intel to be a very good thing. And now, for some reason, I'm working at like a little company
that they'd never heard of.
Did you get fired? Like, what happened, right?
Sure.
Why would you go work for some company that I've never heard of when you had a job at this like super respectable, world famous company? And so that mindset is very important because a lot of these decisions are difficult. And people might be on the fence. Should I stay at my current job? Should I try this crazy new startup or whatever else? And the perception of the people around you is really important. Are they going to respect your decision, or are they going to think that you're foolish? And that can very easily make the difference.
My guest today has been Paul Buchheit. Paul, thanks for being part of EconTalk.
Thank you.
This is EconTalk, part of the Library of Economics and Liberty. For more EconTalk, go to econtalk.org, where you can also comment on today's podcast and find links and readings related to today's conversation. The sound engineer for EconTalk is Rich Goyette. I'm your host, Russ Roberts. Thanks for listening. Talk to you on Monday.